Now it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Professor Jeremi Suri. Jeremi is the Mack Distinguished Professor of Global Leadership, History, and Public Policy. Do you have to write that every time you sign your...
My wife insists that I don't.
Oh, okay. So Jeremi, we recruited Jeremi from the University of Wisconsin, now what, 4 years ago? 3 years ago. And this is an interesting thing, that despite the budgetary and the political issues that sometimes afflict UT, it has not interfered with our ability to go out and recruit top academic talent from peer institutions. Jeremi is the author of 5 books, the most recent, Liberty's Surest Guardian. And I have to say, whenever there's an international crisis of any sort, whether it's Korea launching missiles, Russia invading the Crimean Peninsula, it's always Jeremi that the news media go to get comments and insight. He is our public intellectual on campus on all matters of current events. Just keeping up with his role as a public intellectual is kind of a full-time job. I don't have much time left over to be a dean or something. So on that note, I give you Jeremi Suri.
Well, it's my great pleasure to be back in Midland. I didn't have the fortune of growing up here as that prior speaker, psychologist Sigmund Freud. Who was it? Oh, Jamie Pennebaker. I should get to know him afterwards. It's really great to be back here. As my friend Randy said, we came out here a year ago, and I've been talking about it ever since. I do a lot of traveling and speaking in many places, but I'd never seen a boomtown. So I study boomtowns, I write about them. I told my students in my large 500-person class this semester, when we talk about the boomtowns of the 19th century, now go visit Midland today. And you see exactly that. It's exciting, and it's wonderful for us at the University of Texas that we're part of this. You make us better, and we're better for being part of you. So thank you for hosting us. I want to make a special point of thanking Jennifer Wang and Josh Lodlow. Is Josh in here, or did he step outside? We'll tell him I thanked him, because he's the one who actually really put this together. Randy and I and all of you had been talking about this at the dinner last year, but Josh was the one who really made it happen. Ideas are easy, but Josh put this together. Thank you, Josh. So, a time not so long ago, the United States was coming out of a period of economic decline, precipitous economic decline. And it was stuck in what seemed like a long period of slow growth, having trouble returning to where it had been. And at the same time, there were storm clouds brewing overseas, countries invading their neighbors, grabbing territory, claiming they had a right to this territory because they had some of their own living there, and that historically it was theirs. At this time, a president of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, gave his 3rd inaugural address, having broken the historical rule of running for his 3rd term, just as Jamie Pennebaker is breaking the rule on how we should teach. Pennebaker is the FDR of contemporary education. In his 3rd inaugural address that he wrote himself, Franklin Roosevelt began this way: "To us, there has come a time in the midst of swift happenings to pause for a moment and take stock, to recall what our place in history has been, and to rediscover what we are and what we may be. If we do not, we risk the real peril of isolation and the peril of inaction. Our choices are before us, but our history must be our guide. Our choices are before us, but our history must be our guide." That is what Franklin Roosevelt said to open his 3rd administration, as the country was still dealing with the after effects of the worst economic downturn in our history and watching the world explode around us, uncertain what to do. In early 1941, the United States still had major neutrality legislation on the books, which made it very difficult for us to aid those abroad. We had an armed force of about 100,000 poorly trained soldiers as the Japanese and the Germans were romping over the countries around them. And all of FDR's greatest advisors couldn't figure out how to get the economy moving. We were not as bad as we had been in the early 30s, but everyone knows in this room, the Depression did not really end until World War II. And that was not a pleasant prospect for people in early 1941. What Roosevelt recognized, this tired man who had been in office 8 years and was already beginning to deal with failing health, what he realized was that to look forward, America also had to look back. That history is not about saying what we can't do, but history is about showing us what we can do. History is about, in Lincoln's terms, finding the better angels in our nature, because it is in our past that we can find the imagination, the strength, and the motivation to rethink our present. Because the past did not make the present in the way it is now. The past opened many possibilities, and the present is one of those possibilities we're living in. By looking back, we can see alternatives. By looking back, Franklin Roosevelt pointed out, we can see the choices others have made in similarly difficult circumstances, and we can therefore make better choices today. You see, we don't step in the same river twice, but by looking back at past rivers and currents, we can better understand the current we're in today, and we can take creative inspiration for thinking about doing new things in the currents we face today. The problem with education I think we have today is not the absence of innovation. Jamie Pennebaker is showing how at the University of Texas, I think we're creating all kinds of new innovative ways to teach, and I fully embrace all of that as a historian. Education has always evolved. It always must evolve, right? We must teach a new generation of students in a different way. Our problem is that our students, our teachers, and most of all our society are telling people we can't do things any differently. That we are absent of societal imagination. We are ahistorical thinkers. We think the world is the way it is, and it has to be this way, and we can't make it any different. And I try to remind my students, I just had 500 of them for the last day yesterday, it's kind of sad. I teach at 8 a.m., I ask them, what are they going to do at 8 a.m.? Everyone else is asleep. Right? It's terrible. They come in, they're not happy with the world. They see they don't have the prospects they want to have. They all, without exception, think they're going to have a hard time living as well as their parents. But almost none of them think they can change it. That's not coming from them, that's coming from people around them. That's an ahistorical way of thinking, right? Because the first thing you find when you look at history is that every generation has had the opportunity to change the world. And that the key elements of our society have always been evolving. And seeing this past can help us think about how we can change our world today. So I want to talk about that briefly. I want to give a quick romp through American history here in about the 17 minutes or so that I have left. That might take 18 minutes, we'll see. And talk about three elements of American society. Three issues that if the founders of our society were here, they would focus on. They wouldn't have the answers, but they would tell us something about how our society has changed. And looking quickly at how our society has changed over 200 years, they might also have some ideas for us about how we could think about change going forward. And I want to talk about the really big issues. Democracy, economy, and power. There's nothing else. That's what I write about. Democracy, economy, and power. If you understand those things, you understand everything. Right? Democracy, economy, and power. And I want to think about how our society and our wisdom around these ideas has changed. So let's start with democracy. Here is the single greatest American contribution to world history. We've done more than any other society to think about what democracy means. We have been the intellectual innovators of democracy. We're not the first, nor are we always the best, but we have been obsessed. To think about American history is to think about democracy. And every generation of Americans have asked themselves what democracy means, how you can become a democracy. For the founders, the key questions were, can a diverse people in a large space, a large territory, can they live together governing themselves? That had never happened before. This was the problem of anarchy. Democratic societies have been small. That was the conventional wisdom. The other question was, can a large democracy, if it functions, can it avoid dictatorship? How do you prevent one group from taking advantage of this big space. That is the story of empire that they had all lived and seen. The great innovation of the founders, you all know this if you've read your Federalist Papers, which I know you all. How many people have read the Federalist Papers? All right, shame on you if you haven't. Your homework assignment is go read the Federalist Papers. Right? You can do that before you come to college and take Jamie's course. Right? Read the Federalist Papers. Right? The great innovation in the Federalist Papers is the development of a concept called federalism, or also sometimes called pluralism, which is the notion that a large society can be democratic if there are multiple points of governance that balance one another out. So no one faction, in Madison's terms, can dominate another one, because there are many factions in balance, and no one institution can dominate another one. It is the notion of multiple levels of authority, not just checking each other, but feeding into one another, allowing governance, preventing anarchy, but also preventing dictatorship. That's how American society is founded. That is a radical idea. I can tell you as a historian, almost everyone looking at the Constitution outside of the United States in the late 18th century thinks there's no chance it'll survive. No chance it'll work. That's why Napoleon sells that large swath of territory called Louisiana to the United States, because he thinks he can just get it back after the war. Right? And that's why the British, they don't lose the Revolutionary War. We just raise the costs for them. They say, we'll leave and we'll just come back after they collapse. They put their short-term resources into India and say, long-term, we'll keep our forts in Detroit and in Canada, where they are till 1812, right there in Canada, actually through the 20th century, and we'll just come back. We'll wait for this to fail. We'll wait for this to fail. Well, we proved them wrong in that sense. In the 19th century, the task of democracy was the task of education. The 19th century is the great century of American education. Americans developed this thing, you might have heard of it, called a high school. Right? The notion of a public high school called a common school, where it's really founded in the North. People like Horace Mann and others are crucial. We also invent this thing called testing, standardized testing. Begins actually in Boston, Massachusetts. All things like that begin in Boston, Massachusetts, in the early 19th century. And public education is about democracy. John Dewey says it best in the late 19th century. To be a democracy is to offer the space for everyone to have an opportunity to learn and make their way. Everyone to have an opportunity to learn and make their way. Public education is, as we know it, an American invention. And the land-grant universities. Public higher education is an American invention. Many states, including Texas, the first is Georgia, had created land grants for their universities. And some people get this history wrong. The land is not what's used by the university. The land is given to the university and sold as an endowment to fund the university, right? States did not have a lot of cash, but they had a lot of land. So they convert the land into cash for the universities, right? And then during the Civil War, one of the most amazing pieces of legislation, of course, the Morrill Land Grant of 1862, signed by Lincoln during the Civil War, creates the basis for land grant universities in all the states. And after the Civil War, they were even put in the Confederacy as well. That's how we get that other university we don't like to talk about in College Station. They come as a result of this federal land being used to create public education. The German universities that are the leading universities of the world are not public in the same way in the 19th century. They are closed to the public. American universities are open to the public. In the 20th century, democracy has been about universal suffrage, about broadening the right to vote. That really starts with the 15th Amendment after the Civil War, the 19th Amendment in 1920, guaranteeing women the right to vote, the 24th Amendment in 1964, eliminating poll taxes, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we just celebrated in Austin the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act is equally important in prohibiting most of the voter qualifications that kept people away from the voting booth. And the one that should be most important to my students, though none of them seem to know about it, the 26th Amendment in 1971 that guarantees people 18 and older the right to vote. That's a recent innovation. The success of democracy, there is no doubt about this as a historian, has been in American society that we have consistently broadened participation. We have brought more in. More people have had a stake in our society with each successive generation. This is what has made our democracy strong. This is what has improved American democracy. We must remember that as we go forward. Let me talk about economy. I don't need to talk about economy in Midland. You all know about economy. The question that Americans have confronted from the start: how can a capitalist economy, developing as we did as a capitalist society in a world of mercantilism — mercantilism is about centralized economic control, capitalism is about free ownership of property — in a capitalist economy, a world that is not friendly to capitalism in the 18th century, how can a capitalist economy produce the greatest prosperity? This is really what Thomas Jefferson is writing about, actually, right? When he talks about the Republican yeoman farmer, this is what he's talking about. The founding fathers were rabid capitalists. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. We have great research on this now. They consumed so much. They were entrepreneurs. They loved their private property. They were farmers, craftsmen, and small-scale merchants, and it was hard for them to imagine how someone could be a democrat and a capitalist without owning property, without owning land. And the American dream of owning land goes back to this period, right? If you go and talk to people in other societies, land ownership is not a common thing. In the United States, the American dream has always been to own your own piece of land. In the 19th century, the story of capitalism becomes also the story of free labor. Free labor. This is how you should understand Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln grows up as a poor white child on the frontier in Kentucky, and he hates slavery because slavery is bad for poor white workers. It brings down their wages. It closes off opportunity. He sees his father struggling with this, and he struggles himself with this early on, working as a rail splitter and in other jobs. The opposition to slavery is moral, yes, but it is also about economy. That a society of free labor, where people are educated and have the ability to negotiate for wages for their work, will be a freer and more productive society. That's the free labor argument that Republicans make, that makes the Republican Party. That is what the Republican Party is about in the mid-19th century. Founded, as you all know, in 1850 in Wisconsin, right? That is what the Republican Party is all about, free labor. And it is about labor unions as well. People forget that. Labor needed protection. Lincoln wanted poor white workers to have an ability to negotiate, right? He would have been very happy to see free agency in sports, right? I tell students, if you want to think about what a world without free labor looks like, think about the world of Babe Ruth. Think about the world of Hollywood before the Screen Actors Guild, right? Before Ronald Reagan was head of the Screen Actors Guild, right? Think about what it was like, right? Ronald Reagan, like Abraham Lincoln, is a union guy, right? He was the head of the Screen Actors Guild, which was the union for the workers in Hollywood, for the actors and actresses in Hollywood. In the late 19th century, the story of free labor gets connected to industrialization with new technologies, particularly the railroad, the most important technology of the 19th century. You get an integration of the continental economy, the development of the corporation, right? Railroads make corporations possible. Rockefeller can integrate different parts of industry in real time, across time zones, and most importantly, across weather patterns, thanks to the railroad. It's also the railroad that leads to the final defeat of the Native Americans, right? Because they cannot fight in winter, we can move supplies and destroy them in winter. The railroad allows all of this, creates specialization. And in the 20th century, it bleeds in to the development of wider markets. And most significantly, the importance of government and the state. The story of the American economy, particularly from the late 19th century to the present, has been about the importance of government as well as entrepreneurship. Government has provided the money for the railroads. Government provided the land. Government has provided the law. The first major regulations, interstate regulations to regulate the railroad and regulate the corporations around the railroad. And in fact, the Germans, the French, model their legislation on us. They model it on us. We take ideas of social welfare from Europe, but they take ideas of business regulation from us, in fact. And it provides, the government does, the repeated funding during periods of economic downturn. The problem of the late 19th century is repeated depression, repeated economic downturn. And what the government does is it steps in to provide a basis for that. Let me make this as clear as I can. From the late 19th century through 1960, the United States sees the greatest economic growth of any society in the world at its time, and you could argue, depending on how you look at the data, some of the greatest economic growth any society's experienced in 80 years. And it does it with one of the most intrusive federal governments and with some of the highest taxes. In fact, the generation that went off and fought World War II, they lived through the Depression, they came back, and then they paid the highest personal income tax ever and saw the largest economic growth. No, I'm not advocating for taxes. I just paid my taxes, and I don't like paying taxes. So I'm not advocating for taxes. Many of you pay more taxes than I do. Actually, probably most of you pay more taxes. We need to fix that, Randy. So I'm not advocating for more taxes. And I'm not advocating for government intervention, and I'm not taking a position for my own safety right now, whether the government's too interventionist or not today. But I am arguing it's part of the equation, and you can't take it out. That's the historical lesson there. Doesn't tell us exactly where it should be today, but you can't take it out. You can't take it out. And if you want to know why our business climate looks like it looks, and Russia's looks like it looks, think about the differences in our governments historically. The Russians have been cursed. I study Russia as well, with horrible government, one after another. We've been blessed. Not with great government, but with a lot better than what the Russians have had. It's made a big difference. Let me talk finally about power then. Let me talk about power. This is actually what I really write about. The Founding Fathers are amazing to me because they were remarkably prescient in the dilemmas of power. They were a marginal group of people. They did not have a lot of power, but they thought about it in sophisticated ways because they read history, right? They understood that power is necessary. They wanted their new society to be strong and powerful. Americans have always wanted that. We have never thought of ourselves as being just another country, right? They wanted us to be a city on a hill. They wanted us to be strong and powerful. But they recognized, all of them, from Franklin to Madison to Hamilton, again, look at your Federalist Papers, they recognized that power can be self-defeating too. They were ambivalent about it. You need to be powerful, but you needed to watch how you used your power. Every one of the Federalist Papers is about the risk of tyranny and corruption. That one must be powerful so one is not swallowed by others. One must be careful in how one uses that power. And for the Founding Fathers, there were three things that carry on through the 20th century that protect us in the way we use our power as a society. The three great innovations that we carry forward. One is the notion of checks and balances, right? That different institutions will check each other. We have a presidency, an executive, we have a legislature, we have a judiciary, and then we also have state and federal government. We have checks and balances. That has carried forward, sometimes to the point of stalemate. They have also, the Founders Fathers did also believe that large standing militaries were bad. That we had to be strong and ready to defend ourselves, but had to be citizens defending the society, not permanent professionals. Not a constabulary force, as George Washington put it. So if you read your Constitution, you notice that there's a War Department and a Navy Department. The War Department was the Army. The Navy Department was the Navy. Now, my students always ask me, where was the Air Force? See how they forgot that one. They believed, as small as the Army and Navy were, they had to be separate. That if they were unified, that was dangerous. And they believed that this military force should be small in peacetime and built up to be large in war. And they believed, and it's in the Constitution, that anyone who wants to use this military force has to get the acclamation of the American people, which is to say, has to go to Congress. This was American history through World War II. It's where I started the lecture, right? In 1941, Franklin Roosevelt sees very well what's happening around the world. He has a military force of 100,000 people, right? The Germans sent more to Paris in 2 weeks than we had in our entire military. Well, how Americans had fought wars was the way Lincoln did in the Civil War. You ramp up in the time of war. By 1864, we had the largest standing military in the world. And by 1870, we had one of the smallest again. You ramp up and you ramp down. The military was to be kept out of politics, and the military was to be kept small. Dwight Eisenhower himself believed that. This is not only civilians who said this. Dwight Eisenhower, after World War II, believed the United States had to reduce the size of the military because, in his terms, we could not be a garrison state. And you all know Eisenhower's farewell address. His last speech as president in January 61 is about this, about what he called, this is not some radical communist saying this, the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex. Until 1945, we had avoided one. We might have one today. Third point, in addition to checks and balances and having a small military, the Founding Fathers believed that those who go into government had to have virtue. They believed in what they called political virtue. That those who serve in government should not be professional politicians. That those who serve in government should be skilled. They should be the best of their community. They should go into government, serve for extended periods. There are no term limits in the Constitution. But that they should also come out of government. Government should be a calling, not a profession. A calling, not a profession. And the best people should go into government. And that was generally true until the mid-20th century as well in our society. The Roosevelt family is a great example of it. They grew up, and it was supposed to be for Theodore and then his nephew Franklin. If you were a leading person in society, you went into government. That's what you were supposed to do, public service. Franklin Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy in his 30s, right? State legislature in New York, state legislator in New York State. He started at the bottom, even though he was a Roosevelt, serving in the state legislature, serving as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, serving as governor, and then as President of the United States. Theodore Roosevelt was police chief of New York City. He was police chief. That would be a fun job. To beat up people, right? They believed that power had to be self-limiting. They believed that power had to be self-limiting. And Americans, I think, believe that. What was striking to people around the world at the end of World War II, we know this, I've spent years reading these oral histories, reading the accounts, is when Americans arrived in places, soldiers always do things of different kinds, and there are always bad things that happen when soldiers arrive somewhere. But generally, almost everywhere American soldiers arrived, people were glad it was American soldiers and not someone else. Because American soldiers were not necessarily better trained, not necessarily smarter, but they didn't go in search of taking over other people's societies. The idea was not to empower ourselves at the cost of others. And look at what we did after World War II in Western Europe and Japan, and look at what other societies did, right? The historical comparison is obvious, right? And we can see why those living in West Germany were happy to live in West Germany, and those living in East Germany needed a wall to keep them in, right? You can see the difference in how societies operated. And I think that's still true. But I think what's happened as a historian since 1945 is we've become too comfortable with power. We've become too comfortable with power. We've defined ourselves too much by power. I think the Founding Fathers would look at our society and they'd say we've become more democratic in ways that might actually horrify them. Many of them would be surprised that women can vote, that one of them will be running for president, right? This would be surprising, that we could have two female secretaries of state. It would be very surprising to them. They'd also be surprised to see how our economy operates, the technology we use. But I think they'd see it as of a piece with the democracy and economy they had in mind. This is how democracy encourages self-governance, and this is how an economy creates prosperity. But I think they would find the most difficulty in understanding our approach to power, in seeing ourselves as having some right, some necessary commitment to being so powerful in all ways, and how power has become an end in and of itself. They'd be surprised, I think, to see the ways in which institutions, including the military, commit themselves to the use of resources on the scale they do. They would be surprised to see the evidence of greed in our society. They would be surprised to see the lack of political virtue in a lot of what we do. Think how infrequently we talk about that. Everything they talked about was political virtue. Go back and read anything they wrote in real time. Read their newspapers. Think then how little we talk about that today. I think they would look at our society and say that in some ways we have become corrupted. In some ways power has made us too greedy. In some ways power has taken us away from what we believe in. And I think they would say that this is correctable. I think they would argue that we must remember what our society is about and what we are for. And I make this point not because I want to criticize our society, though I do think it's our role as scholars to provoke. That's why we research, is to provoke people to think. But I make this point because I don't think it's a fatal flaw. I think it's about our departing from some of the historical wisdom. I'm a historian not because I want us to live in the past, but because I want us to use the wisdom of the past as we interrogate and implement new technologies today. And the problems of our society today, the problems of partisanship, the problems of greed, the problems of self-interest, the problems of aggrandizement, are problems that are not built into the system, they're built into the way we're practicing the system. This has to stop. This has to stop. And if we look back we can remember another way. And I hope we'll do that as a society. Thank you. Okay, so, yes, sir. I can't see your name tag, I'm sorry. Lynn, I'm sorry.
Are you taking questions?
Absolutely. And criticisms.
Okay.
But those can be directed at Randy.
Can you imagine for us a panel discussion with Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson reacting to the Federal Reserve System?
Great question. Great question. So this is a really good question and a smart question because you know that Hamilton and Jefferson had opposite views on this, right? So Hamilton's belief, Hamilton is the great economic mastermind of the early period, right? First of all, he has the federal government take over the state debts coming out of the Revolution to provide credibility to the United States, and he creates the Bank of the United States. Jefferson opposed this. Jefferson opposed this because he felt it gave too much power to New York bankers. This is what Jefferson opposed, and Jefferson also believed that, in fact, the states should be able to float their own currencies. Hamilton was moving toward, we don't have the dollar as a greenback until after the Civil War, but Hamilton was moving toward that notion, right? So if we had a panel discussion today on the Federal Reserve, I think Alexander Hamilton would, in fact, say that a lot of what the Federal Reserve has done has been beneficial to the American economy in two levels. It provided a basis for lubricating economic activity through managing capital, and secondly, that the Federal Reserve has preserved the credibility of the United States, right? I tell my students, the thing we take for granted is we can print dollars and people take them. Putin can print rubles, but a lot of people aren't going to take them, right? So that's the position Hamilton would take.
Well, but Federal Reserve notes and greenbacks are different.
That's correct, but the greenbacks, I would argue today the greenback is what it is because of the Federal Reserve. Right, that you couldn't have them without, they develop independently or in parallel with each other, but right now it's hard to imagine the greenback without the Federal Reserve, right? Jefferson, I think Lynn would argue that the Federal Reserve is undemocratic, and that they make decisions that serve a particular group of people, and he would be appalled, Jefferson would, to see Timothy Geithner as Secretary of Treasury, and I don't know what you think about Ben Bernanke, but he would have a problem with the Geithner-Volcker connection, and the way in which the Federal Reserve, its main goal, I think it's quite obvious, right, is to make sure that the banking system as we know it, which benefits a particular group in American society more than others, continues to function in that way. So Jefferson would I think, have very strong arguments against it, and I do think it's fair to say that he would not support the gold standard as Rand Paul does, but some of Rand Paul's other arguments, I think he would embrace. Rand Paul, I tell people, I'm not a supporter of Rand Paul, but Rand Paul's arguments are not historically flawed. They have some historical basis to them. And I think I'm all for real debate in our political system. So even though I'm not a supporter of his, I think his bringing out a Jeffersonian argument is actually a very good thing, because we were only hearing most of the Hamiltonian argument before that. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Yes. Yes, sir. What's your first name?
Fred.
Fred.
How well is the balance system working currently in the U.S.? Do you have a personal position on determining this?
So the first question about checks and balances. So I think the checks and balances system is broken down. But I don't think it's broken down because one federal or executive is acting and others are cowering. I think it's broken down because the checks and balances system presumes that you're going to have creative proposals from all sides and compromise between them. The checks and balances system is not about vetoes alone, right? It doesn't say just veto, veto, veto. And so when the system works well, right, the states are laboratories of innovative policy. And the federal government is trying to innovate policy, and they find a place to come together. That's what happened in the early 20th century. That's what progressivism was all about, right? That's how we have the elimination of child labor, right? Child labor laws begin in certain states, then the federal government gets interested in them, and you get an overall compromise. Same thing with civil rights, right? Civil rights story is not just the federal government, right? Many states, unfortunately not too many in the South, were moving on these issues, right? And then what you had was a negotiation between the Justice Department and the northern states that then involves the southern states and continues into the questions of school busing. So that's how the system should work. I say the same thing between the branches of government, right? The legislature and the presidency and the judiciary should all be doing this. I think it's broken down now Because what we have instead of that, we have a desire for these branches not to work with each other. And particularly at the federal to state level, there's an absence of compromise. There's an absence of work there, and the blame goes both ways. The governors of the United States need to be willing to work with the president, but the president has to make the effort to work with them. It has to go both ways. And that's broken down, and it's bigger than Obama and Perry. It's about a structural shift that's occurred in the way people think about these things. And it's about really ahistorical thinking. They don't understand what it means, how these systems have worked together before. This is not the first time at all we've had political differences like we have. It's what we're doing about those political differences. I think, Fred, political differences are good. It's what do you do with them. The second part of your question, I've forgotten.
Do you have a personal position on term limits?
So generally I'm not, in theory, a supporter on term limits, but I've come to believe as a practical matter they might make some sense in the short run. I'm going to take a wishy-washy position on this. But I think because of the way the system of campaign funding works now, it's very hard to unseat someone who's in office, especially at the federal level. And people are in office too long, some of them. So I'd like to see more rotation. And if that in the short term required term limits, I'd be for that. Philosophically, my problem is I believe that there can be virtuous people, like a Franklin Roosevelt, right, who in times of emergencies can serve longer, right? But in theory, I believe in rotation, and I think we don't have enough rotation. So in the short run, I would support term limits. Yes, ma'am. What's your first name?
Donna, what are your feelings on, or what do you think the founders would think about the trend of low voter turnout?
Well, I mean, I think they would look at it and see it as high voter turnout, actually, because they would say what you have is a higher proportion of the population voting than they had in their time. But what they would be struck with is, again, this point I was trying to close on, and I'm feeling more and more critical of our society the more I say this, that a lot of people who have the opportunity to participate and make a positive difference don't, right? The absence of political commitment, right? Which I think voter turnout is one manifestation of, right? This is the world we live in where people want a lot from society but don't actually want, and feel they can't because they're too busy, as we are, right, to contribute more. And so they would see that as a symptom of the absence of political virtue, right? For them, a democracy functioned when people were stakeholders and active contributors to it. And voting was just one marker of that. This is what I say in my Nation Builder book. I write about this a lot. It's not about whether a country has an election or not. It's about whether people are participating, right? I mean, Saddam Hussein had elections. Putin's going to have another election, right? It's not the election alone that makes your democracy. It's, are people participating? Is there civic engagement? Are people part of the process? And that's what they would notice there's less of today than in their time. And it's gone down in the last 20 years by almost every measure. Yes, sir. What's your first name?
Richard. One of our important documents starts, "We are endowed by our Creator."
Mm-hmm.
All right? And that has had a tremendous historical impact on the early beginning and generation and movement of this country. Now you speak of how power has been, shall we say, more corrupting in the last several decades, more greed, more all of that. How much of that is because people have forgotten that? Because by saying we are endowed by our Creator also implies we are responsible to our Creator as well for the well-being of others. How much of the lack of that now transfers over to people just, well, I'm going to do it my own way?
It's a great question, Richard. So first, I think it needs to be said that you're absolutely right. Historically, religion has always been a key part of American society, and as you say, it's in the language they use. And Americans have consistently been a more religious society than other societies, no matter how you measure it, in terms of church attendance, in terms of identifying themselves that way. It always strikes Europeans that Americans are throwing the God word around so much more than Europeans, which is ironic considering where Europe comes from historically. So I think that's an accurate argument. I'll also say myself, I'm the child of Indian and Russian Jewish immigrants to the U.S. I'm a Hindu. There are 3 of us in the world, myself and my 2 kids. And that's the American story as well. And it comes to your point, right? Being also open to people of different religious backgrounds. I've never felt, having a Hindu father and a Jewish mother, that I've been excluded. In fact, I sometimes feel guilty. I get to be both, right? And then some people don't know my background, look at me and think I'm white, so I get that too, right? I get everything, right? I mean, so that's part of the American story as well. But I think what has happened is that it's not the absence of religion, Richard, in aggregate, but there might be some ways in which this plays out in certain elements. But I don't see the more religious being less corrupted by power. I don't see them being more corrupted by power. I think it's the absence of humility. So you can be invoking the Creator, but if you think that you are the extension of the Creator, you're in a lot of trouble, right? And maybe I'm speaking from a Jewish Hindu tradition here. Maybe you all have a different tradition. But in both of my backgrounds, in my muddled background, right? The one thing I learned was we deserve very little. We are grateful for what we have, and we try to give back. Work hard, and be grateful for what comes of it, right? And when I hear people going around saying, we deserve this, and we deserve that, and we deserve this, and give us this, and give us that, I think that's not necessarily the absence of religion, that's the absence of the humility that should come from what I think has been the more traditional way Americans have thought of religion. Not that God made us great and the world owes us, but God gave us an opportunity, and now we need to do the best we can with that for ourselves and for others. So that's where I come. That's where I come. So one more question. I saw Miles. Yeah.
Sure. Of course,
I waited for this one for last. I know it's going to be a singer here.
I certainly take issue with your tax stance. Late 1800s, I may be wrong, but I think there was very little taxation. And you could argue the late 1800s was the largest expansion of the economy in the history of the world. Number one, I want you to comment on that.
Yeah, sure.
Also, that the government was only 3% of GDP as opposed to 20% of GDP as it is today.
Mm-hmm.
And also, secondly, just comment on that, how our founding fathers would have looked on taxation, and also, why do you leave the 80s and the 90s out?
To try to save myself up here. Yes, I mean, time. I didn't have time, Miles. Come on. So you're right. You're right and you're wrong at the same time, right? I mean, so in the late 1800s, there was no federal income tax. Absolutely right. Right. Federal income tax is early 20th century, right? And even in the beginnings, it's a tax only at the very, very top. Right? So at the federal level, there's less taxation. Where does the money come from for the federal government in the late 19th century? Anybody know? Tariffs.
Duties and land.
Yeah. Duties and land. The majority is from tariff and the rest is from land. That's right. So there's a surplus, actually, right? So there's a taxation on duty. There's a taxation on land, right? There's taxation on what you're trading. And you have the rise in the late 19th century of very high municipal taxes. So yes, you're probably right that in the late 1900s they're paying a lot less tax as a percentage of income than any of us would today, but it's certainly higher than it had been before, and it's moving in that direction, right? So that was my point, the trend. If you take from the late 1800s to 1960, which of course is this period of enormous economic growth, the tax trend is up, not down. Now you could say, and maybe you're right, this is a fair argument, that the economy grows despite that, but you can't say that chokes off the growth. Right? Because that's the trend, right? You go from increased urban and municipal taxes, increased land taxes as the duties are reduced, then increased duties again with the McKinley tariff, the income tax, and it just goes up, right? By the end of World War II, right, Americans are paying as much as 70% as personal income tax. I'm not advocating that, right? But look at what the economy does, right? You can't say that that is necessarily choking off the economy. You can say it's unfair. I think it's unfair to charge people that much tax, but I don't think it necessarily closes off the economy. Then in terms of a percentage of GDP, so again, we go back and forth on this, right? Yes, in 1880, 1890, the federal government is a very small portion of American GDP, but not true in 1870, right? With the end of the Civil War, right, the United States government is the largest employer in the United States, and it remains the largest employer for quite a while after. And the period of greatest railroad construction, money comes from government. The money comes from the government, not just as cash, but also as land. Land that is turned over, right? So what Leland, Stanford, Cornelius, Vanderbilt do, they get land grants and government support for that. And in some cases, the government even owns part of the railroad. So it kind of goes up and down. It's definitely true the government today has, for a long period, probably been a larger part of the economy than it had been before. But it is not unprecedented for it to be part of the economy. I'm simply saying you can't take it completely out, right? That it's going to be there. It's a question of where the right level should be and what are the best ways to use government to encourage business activity and economic growth.
Thank you, Jeremy and Jamie, for a wonderful first part of our morning.